From an economically crippling global pandemic to an historic U.S. election, this is undoubtedly one of the most challenging times for generations. Hello and welcome to On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Our COVID numbers appear to be in decline. Some restrictions are relaxed. And for the first time in months, our tourism sector appears to be moving to reopening. But does that mean we are in the clear? What happens next? Tonight on The Record, we discuss the way forward, an in-depth look at what is to come, how we get our economy back on track, and one of my personal favorites, the impact of the U.S. elections. Our discussions on the way forward get started right after this break. Project really pays itself.
Correct.
They set up
at the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
You're watching On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Tonight, we discuss the way forward. We are talking about managing the coronavirus, revitalizing the tourism sector, strengthening our economy, and believe it or not, the effects of the U.S. elections on us here in the Bahamas. On November 1st, we witnessed the relaxation of heavy travel restrictions. Those alone have been a deterrent to vacationers coming here. My guest for this segment of the show has years of experience in tourism and hospitality. He is well known on the airwaves and is also the managing director of the Downtown Nassau Partnership. Ed Fields, welcome to On the Record. Good to have you with us this evening.
Jerome, it's a pleasure being with you.
So let's start out by talking about the state of businesses in downtown Nassau. We're looking at about 8 months now into this pandemic. I drive through quite a bit, and it always distresses me when I hit Bay Street because for me, that seems to be sort of the antithesis of where we are. But what is the state of those businesses in the downtown area particularly?
Jerome, you know, what's interesting is for many, many years, we would talk about the fact that the perception that cruise ship industry, the cruise ship business, was not that viable as far as the amount of spend in the country. The reality is that almost every single business downtown probably relies in the high 90% on the cruise ship industry. And so the moment that cruise ships stopped sailing is the moment that those businesses were impacted. And hence, you know, no matter, as you can see that the local, I mean, obviously there are restrictions on retail, et cetera, but I think even void of those restrictions, the reality is that the local marketplace is not enough to drive those businesses downtown. And so until the cruise ships are back, and when I say back, I'm talking back to normal operating procedures, we're going to have an impact downtown.
Is there a clear path to recovery right now? Is there something that we can look at this point and say, this is the way out for us or the way forward?
You know, Jerome, one of the things I think that frustrates citizens of the world is that they feel is as if there's nothing being done to try to get to that point. The one thing that I always draw to is this: it's not as if this problem is isolated to the Bahamas or, for that matter, even the Caribbean. It is a global problem. Tourism is the largest growing business in the world, and so every country who has some reliance on tourism is obviously trying to figure out the same thing. The only nuance and I don't even know it's a nuance, it's really the gorilla, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, with regard to the Bahamas and some other Caribbean destinations, is that our economy is almost solely reliant on tourism. And so we're so impacted. And hence the capacity to open up is complex, and it's complex for a couple of reasons. One, our primary market, the United States of America, is the worst hotspot on the planet. That's number one. Number two, we also have COVID here that we're still trying to control. You know, as we speak, we're something like, I think we're at alert 4 on the U.S. travel advisory list with regard to health-related issues, and that, of course, is directly related to COVID. And so, you know, we're now going through a regime, as you know, where we have made every possible effort to control COVID's entry into the Bahamas. We're testing residents, we're testing visitors, we're testing anyone who comes into the country, to the point that we are fairly confident, because we saw how it worked prior to July, fairly confident that we can control COVID coming into the country. The problem is, of course, is that you also have thousands and thousands of employees who have to interact with our visitors. And the concern is, in my view, not so much now as visitors giving COVID to Bahamians, but more the reverse, and also Bahamians in a more, more congregant environment, i.e. lots of employees going back to work at the same time, giving it to each other, and hence creating more community spread. I was on a call yesterday where, you know, it was voiced that one of the really big concerns is that when people go back to work, what they're finding is that people then, after work, go to, you know, places where they can congregate and hang out and have a couple of beers, et cetera, and hence the cycle starts again. So we are in a kind of a really kind of nuanced, complicated scenario. And I think, I think people, when they're seeing these measures, think, well, these people are just making stupid decisions, or these people are not thinking this clearly. No, there are so many variables that it is a very difficult thing to do. And we've seen how, you know, businesses have opened up. Many businesses have opened up, and within a couple of days or a couple of weeks, they have to close down because 2 or 3 people in their organization had tested positive. It is very complex.
Ed, there's been a lot of back and forth since the announcement of the relaxation of the travel restrictions. We would have heard previously that, you know, the antigen tests were going to be administered when people arrive. That's no longer in place. They've removed the 14-day quarantine that was mandatory. You still need the PCR test to come in. There's some other things that are being put in place. Is there confidence? And when I say confidence, I'm talking about confidence amongst those who are operating the businesses that are affected by tourism, and even our tourism partners, things that you can garner. Is there confidence that we can control this time around? We opened up in July. We know what happened then. We learned some very painful, but I think necessary lessons. But is there confidence that we can control this time around as people start arriving again and as we start reopening? Because that's a reality. We are reopening.
Right. Jerome, you know, one of the things that's so very, very important is data, okay? And what we knew and what we found out, and this doesn't come from me. In fact, I think you and I might have been on the show when we were talking to Dr. Nakia Forbes. And the question that I put to Dr. Forbes was this. Prior to July 1 and during the first part of July, when visitors were coming to the country and were being tested and repatriations were occurring and the people who were being brought back to the country were being tested, were there any traces of COVID to those visitors? And if you recall at the time, and I don't know what's changed, the answer was 0.
Yes.
So there is a degree, I think you recall that. So there is a degree of data that says that even if you don't get 100%, the reality is that as a result of the PCR testing, and if you recall in those days, it was 10 days out.
Right.
This is now 5 days out, okay? That the testing that was done prior to coming to the Bahamas, and let's not forget, That continued up to today. Everyone had to be tested. The error that was made, and it caused a lot of emotional response to it, was that the testing that, or the lack of testing for people who went, Bahamians, who went to places within 72 hours, that's where it was traced from. I'm not, we don't need to revisit that because those cases may have gone past. But the reality is the people who were tested showed very low to zero prevalence of any signs of positive testing.
What's the concern now with, and you mentioned it, with the United States? I mean, as we talk to you, we still don't know who is, the clear winner in the elections, as we sit down at this point to have this discussion. But what is the concern with the tourists who are coming from the United States, the amount of travel? The reality is Bahamians have already started traveling to the U.S. again, of course, under different circumstances to return this time. But what is the concern as the United States continues to be that COVID hotspot on the globe?
Right. So we're left with choices. And this whole dilemma that we're in is about choices, okay? There is nothing perfect. So even, and I heard a health official say it yesterday, and I was surprised because it's a view that I've held, we can't literally test our way out of this, okay? We can't, testing is not the placebo, I wouldn't say the placebo, but the panacea that everyone thinks it is, because the reality is a test is only an indication of the time that you got tested. But what we're hopeful is that with this testing and with the short window coming in, and then of course people who are staying past 4 or 5 days getting tested, that this is the best we can do in order to have some semblance of the economy being restored without being kept careless and not having anyone come at all, which is not sustainable for us. Obviously, we also hope that the window between now, which would not have been the case in March, but the window between now and when some sort of medical mitigations, i.e. a vaccine or a therapeutic can be put into the market, that window is shortened, because as soon as people can be vaccinated, obviously, for instance, from the cruise ship perspective, every person who's going to go on a cruise ship is going to be vaccinated. So once that happens, there's going to be no concern for that visitor to meander about town, and essentially would have negated the concern about the prevalence of COVID here. So this is the example I used, Jerome, and I think maybe you would have heard it as well, is like, when I was a kid, I had this fear of two things from watching TV: dying in quicksand or being stranded in space when the ship wouldn't turn on, because both of those are slow deaths, okay? If you are in space and you are stranded, your number one concern is running out of oxygen. Right now, that's the analogy I make, okay? We are stranded in a place where the oxygen supply is getting lower and lower, and what we're hoping for is some mitigation, the rescue ship, so to speak, to come and rescue us, or at very minimum, to bring us a fresher supply of oxygen. And that's really where we are.
I had, as I go into the next question, it's interesting you brought that up. But I had a conversation with someone in business the other day, and I said, when is the last time a US dollar came into your hand? And he said, I can't tell you. And I said, great. That you begin to understand now the severity of the situation when, as travelers to the U.S., sometimes we didn't even need to go to the bank to get U.S. money. It's just what you accumulated over a period of time from just your regular transactions. So that's, that's a good barometer for where we are in terms of the U.S. dollars that aren't in the economy.
Right. And our foreign reserves, from an economic perspective, is our oxygen supply. Okay. So we're waiting for that. I think it's fairly okay now, but we're going to start tap into that, and then we're going to be waiting for that oxygen supply from the U.S. And from other markets, because there are other currencies that are important to us, start to flow back in again.
This week we learned that Bahamas phased reopening will begin on the 17th of December. And of course, we know that this is the time that we're usually into our peak tourism season. Do you believe that we will have enough tourists traveling to even see a 50% occupancy at the major hotels once they start to reopen? talking specifically now to a Bahamar that says, okay, 17th of December is our date?
Yeah. I can't speak to what the bookings are for Bahamar, and for that matter, for any hotel. Obviously, they see bookings, and they would see, I would assume they would see enough bookings to at least structure their cost structure to at least break even and to start to ramp up. That's the only real kind of comment I could make from a speculative perspective. Obviously, no one wants to, start on a dime. I think they see that they need to get their employees back to work. They want to get their employees back to work. They want to start, they have financial obligations, payables, et cetera. They want to start generating income. So at the very minimum, they're going to look at what is economically or financially viable for them to open up with, so that they can at least break even.
I know, just in talking to a few people who I know who work at Bahamar, it was almost a breath of fresh air for them. They thought, okay, finally we again see that light at the end of the tunnel. But that now brings me to my question about the role of residents, Bahamians in all of this, because we have a role to play as well, particularly those of us who work in the tourism industry. What is that role that we have to play? We always look to the government and all of these other, entities and organizations to lead the charge and to guide us and to direct us and to make policy, et cetera. But what is our individual roles as Bahamians in all of this as we move now to this reopening?
Jerome, I think the best way to say this without any inkling or any kind of hint of being offensive is to say to all our fellow Bahamians, we need to do a reset. And what I mean by that is this: no matter how we have thought about things, no matter what our persuasions are, we need to now say, what can we do as individuals? And it requires a degree of selflessness. What can we do as individuals to preserve that economic breath of fresh air that you call it? So, for instance, if I'm a worker at one of these resorts, been out of work for 6-7 months, what you have to say, and what you have to say collectively, and what you have to say to your team, your fellow team members, is this: we go to work, we do not gather, we adhere to COVID protocols relentlessly and religiously. We wear a mask. When we're finished with work, we go home and we just stay home, and we go to the food store or do what we need to do. That is what you do to preserve your job and to preserve your associate's job. Or you can say, hey, I'm back. I've got some money in my pocket. When I knock off from work, I can go down by the local bar or by the local pub or by the local whatever, and I'm going to hang around, and I'm going to have 3, 4, 5 drinks, be all jovial, etc.
Have fun.
And have fun. Yeah. Sorry, Jerome. Thanks for making it. And spread some COVID. Okay. That's really it. It's as simple as that.
Interestingly, in the last press conference, we would have heard Dr. Dal Regis talk about the things that we do culturally that have contributed to the spread. So very good point. And it's not just sort of going out, after work, but the other things that we do that are tied to our culture that have put us at risk. And, you've got to be honest, we're not the only people that like to assemble. People in general do that. That's what we do as humans. Final question. Are we really on the right track to the revitalization of our tourism industry? Understanding that, officials tell us and all the experts tell us it's a very fluid situation, and there's always the balance between the concerns with public health as well as the concerns with the long-term economic recovery, which is a difficult balance. But are we on the right track when it comes to trying to revitalize our tourism industry and to do it safely?
Well, there are two sides to that question that I'd like to maybe address. One is that we have to really accept that the stakeholders in this have a tremendous amount to lose. And while, you or I may be sitting at home and saying, well, why don't they do this, or why don't they do that? You have to believe, Jerome, that the stakeholders, that is the shareholders of these institutions, the employees, everyone, the government, are saying to themselves, what can we do to get this rolling. These are not people who are void of any sort of intelligence, okay? They want to be open, they want to be functioning properly. And so the reality is that there's this thing out there called COVID, and it's really not into being a part of the plan. Okay, it's not really, it's like I say with, you know, I for many years managed a golf course. You know, Mother Nature doesn't care about your cost base. The grass is going to grow. And so if you decide to cut back on mowing, Mother Nature isn't going to say, oh, you know what, I understand that the management team cut back on mowing, so let's hold back on growing, okay? No, Mother Nature is not interested. And COVID is in the same mode. It is not involved with the thought process, planning that we have. We don't know how it's moving. And so I really would like for Bahamians to appreciate that if there was a magic wand, a magic switch that someone could take, they would take it. Are there errors that are made? Yes, there's no doubt about that. Those errors are made, though, because you're dealing with an unknown element. So I think that all the effort that is, well, certainly you can always, you know, make, have it better, you know, tweak things. But I think that the effort is gargantuan and that is being made. The next question, or the other part of that question, Jerome, is how do we look at tourism nationally going forward? And I think we have to look at it in different ways that would make it more resilient. You know, this issue about diversity, that is a long, at best, medium to long-term objective. It is certainly not overnight. Tourism didn't take place overnight when we were just a fishing village. And so we're going to have to now see what we can do to strengthen our tourist product and to protect it going forward. My view is that we need to expand how we look at tourism. That we, you know, for instance, in the Family Islands, you know, we should be promoting more second home. We call them visitors, but really they're long-term tourists.
Yeah, definitely. You know, there's so many other discussions that are going to have to take place after this, but most important for us right now is getting out of it. And that's, I'm hoping that's where we're singularly focused, and not so much getting out in terms of doing away with it, but how do we coexist and how do we work within, you know, the confines that we have, the realities that are here. But again, Ed Fields, Managing Director of Downtown Nassau Partnership, thank you so much for coming on the record and sharing that insight with us. We really do appreciate it.
Not a problem.
All right, don't go anywhere. To our guests, when we come back, we're going to speak with two members of the Economic Recovery Committee about the recommendations made to the government and how we can get our economy back on track. Stay with us. Welcome to On the Record.
Looking for more On the Record? If you miss our Thursday showing at 8 p.m., join us for the re-airing on Friday mornings at 10, and then again each Sunday night at 8:30. Or go to our YouTube channel and catch up on all of our past episodes. And then like our Facebook and Instagram pages for a preview of upcoming shows and get a chance to ask your questions. Just look for On the Record.
You're watching On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. This segment is brought to you by our friends at Executive Printers. In April, the Prime Minister announced the appointment of an Economic Recovery Committee. Their main function, to make recommendations to the Cabinet on the long-term economic recovery of the economy, including job creation and stimulating small business recovery and development in response to COVID-19. My guests for this portion of the show are two members of that committee, Mrs. Khrystle Rutherford Ferguson, chair of the Bahamas Chamber of Commerce and Employers Confederation, and Matt Aubry, Executive Director of the Organization for Responsible Governance. Welcome to both of you, or welcome back to both of you, to On the Record. Good to have you with us again. So, Matt, Khrystle, we know that both of you not only served on the overall committee, but also co-chaired and sat on a few subcommittees in relation to the Economic Recovery Committee, which produced the executive summary report. So let's start out by talking about what the experience was like for both of you being a part of such a very important committee that really had the task of charting the way forward economically for our country in light of an unprecedented event.
I think it was ways. Both Khrystle and myself also had the distinction of serving on the National Coordinating Committee for COVID. So we had started working with a multi-sector group already, looking at how does the nation respond, and that was really in the instance of the first wave. So a lot of the work that we had started in ensuring that on my part, civil society was represented, and on Khrystle's part, that the business sector was sitting at the table in these high-level discussions, was able to carry forward. And there were some key folks that had also been working with us in that capacity. So there was a bit of the continuity, I think, of what was looking at for our immediate response blended right into working on that. But I think it was to be commended that the bulk of the committee was drawn from outside of government, and I think that was a key message, and I think that was something very important. Our co-chairs, the Financial Secretary Marlon Johnson, and then Ken Kerwood, who were coming from the private sector, really worked to ensure that as we were looking at information, that it was actionable and sustainable. And so it was an interesting exercise where folks from all different sides of the country really were with some very specific goals and trying to move those forward. So in that instance, I think it was a good precedent.
Khrystle, do you think people were aware of the level of expertise that were on that committee? I remember when it was first announced, people said, "Oh, it's the same old faces, same old people." I sort of had a different view, but were people, or was the public aware really of the level of expertise and where you were all coming from and what you were bringing to the table?
I think so, and I think, quite frankly, it was a pleasure. It was still indeed a pleasure to serve on the committee, especially at such a pivotal time when there's so much work to be done. And for my part in particular, being able to represent the interests of the business community, being chair of the Chamber of Commerce and sitting at the table to speak to the issues and give input on the direction forward and how the business community can get involved, especially in charting the course forward. It is, I think the public was aware and are aware of the expertise that were at the table. And furthermore, I was pleased to see that the expertise did not just stop with those persons who were actually appointed to the committee, but also involved were persons from the other private sector groups, from public sector. You have your citizenry, and there were a number of subcommittees and focus groups that lend their expertise and had a hand in what you saw come about through the executive summary.
It was important, as you mentioned, the subcommittees and focus groups, because I think people were concerned that you weren't going to get input from pockets and large majorities. I mean, when you consider this affected and continues to affect every single sector of the economy, did you get a broad enough view, and did you get input from a wide section of the country and a wide section of stakeholders?
I sincerely believe so. And the reason why I believe so is because there were a number of town hall meetings that were held by different virtual platforms and live streamed on other social media outlets. So that provided the opportunity for everyone to be able to have a say. Notwithstanding that, there was an email address that was created for the sole purpose of getting broad consultative recommendations from everyone across country. And that particular element of the deliberation was very, very important because as you put it, this is something that affects all of us. So it's important for every one of us to feel like we had a say in the recommendations.
Matt, I'm
I-
going to
I
ask
also-
you. Sure, I know you want to answer, but I got to dive into this because we've got to move forward. And you
Sure.
can sort of tie the two together. In the executive summary, there were some cross-cutting themes throughout the different subcommittees. One of them being making substantial investments in critical infrastructure by leveraging state assets and partnering with the private sector. Matt, I know public-private partnership to be your expertise. Tell us a little bit more about this.
So I think just a quick nod, part of the design of being inclusive, the committee being inclusive, not only entailed us making sure we were talking to lots of folks, but also that we were drawing upon reference points that had been well established and prior to that, well consulted. Remember, we were doing a lot, very, very short amount of time. So when we went back to look at that, what we saw were many, many instances from the National Development Plan to IDB, work that the government had already started, call out from private interest groups around this need to ensure that infrastructure and things were moving forward, but that it was doing so in a way where you saw the blend of the government direction standards, but also the innovation and the expediency and the expertise of the private sector. And so as we look at this whole report, what you see as a general theme is streamlining, but also tapping into spaces and places where maybe we haven't leveraged enough resource. So when you think about moving forward with infrastructure, which is something that you'll see globally in the economic recovery, it's making sure that these projects move forward. Ones that have either stalled or were in progress and maybe could be moved forward because of what they represent in the local economy, what they bring to the table. They bring jobs, they bring contracts, they create consumption, and that's something that we critically need at this point. But they also ensure that it is going to be diverse and inclusive in how we move forward. And we also have recognized that as an issue prior to this. And fundamentally, what this process I think revealed was that there's no silver bullet and there's not too many brand new ideas. It's really a matter of going back to things that we've identified, issues that were in place before or areas of opportunity that were in place before. And now it's incumbent upon us to move forward into the benefit of the country to make sure that these things materialize. And I think the whole theme of it is how do we get these things into action? And the relationship between government, private sector, civil society, any multi-sector environment can push forward action on these projects.
I want to delve a little bit deeper into the infrastructure recommendations. I mean, we would have seen the pushback from the public on the government's decision to go ahead with the building the sidewalks, and you know, at the time people were saying, well, you're cutting back on the unemployment benefit. You know, people are in need of food, monies to pay bills, live every day, but we're putting down sidewalks. Help us again to understand why a project like that would have been brought forward at a time like this, and what is it designed to do?
Well, I think as we talk about how these things roll out and the whole discussion of execution is something that I'm not sure either of us on the civil society and private sector side can speak to, because that is ultimately the purvey of government. But the direction of moving forward with infrastructure was to accelerate things that were in queue. And it sounds like that was a project that was already in queue. Meeting the direct needs of our citizens, making sure that people who are in need of food is something that is being done. But generating things that build in levels of sustainability and security are critical. So creating environments and projects that generate jobs, that keep people at work, that put money into the economy, that give people the capacity and the dignity to drive forward their own existence versus increasing a dependency on government, I think is also a theme that you'll see. And so I would say that it probably falls under that category.
Okay, Khrystle, another interesting theme was enabling the takeoff of Grand Bahama and our family islands by island-specific development plans shaped with the inputs of stakeholders on those islands. Can you tell us why this was so important?
Well, it's important for us to have a holistic view of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And we can't just be Nassau-centric, and I think you'd see that a recurring theme in the report was to move away from any notion that we were Nassau-centric in our recommendations. You'll see that the recommendations touch a broad range of the other family islands. And for that reason, it's important to make sure that you have persons on the ground in those family islands prepared to sit around the table as well and weigh in on the future of their own part of the economy. It's very important, as I said, that we look at this holistically, because the key to coming out of this as a stronger Bahamas is ensuring that we look at all of the potential jewels, to look at how do we bring together the entire country in a way which is focused on development, focused on improving the economy in a sustainable way, and also focused on ensuring that moving forward, the country could be more resilient if we have other unforeseen circumstances that come about.
I think it
Another
also
one of the
allows
big.
for the
Go ahead, man.
it
Very
also
quickly.
allows for the potential and the power that we see in our locality. We've had discussions prior to the outbreak around local government, and you've seen instances like in Abaco, there were communities that went after real property tax that the government had been unable to gain, and they wildly exceeded what government's expectation was. So how do we ensure now that we gather as much resources that are supposed to come back to the country by putting it in the hands of the locality, and then also involving those locals in how their communities are built? It builds ownership, it builds resilience, it builds sustainability.
One of the other cross-cutting themes was the diversification of the economy. My previous guest touched on it a little bit, but what are some of the other areas or industries or sectors that we can look at in the medium to long term that actually make sense when we talk about diversifying the economy at a time when there's such a heavy reliance and dependency on tourism, and then right behind it, financial services?
I think it's important for us to look at agriculture, because the reality of the situation is, notwithstanding the ability to ramp up production in the agricultural space will require some work and some time, it is something that we could focus on because it will assist in long-term sustainability, in making sure that we're able to utilize more of our islands in a way where we can produce more, we can look at exporting. So that in and of itself, the agricultural space, I really believe, and I firmly believe that it is an opportunity for the Bahamas to diversify what we've been doing before and really put some focus on that.
Matt, how do we talk about diversifying at a time when we are still struggling to get that number one industry back on track, when tourism is the engine, and in line with what a former Director General of Tourism said, we need not delude ourselves. I mean, tourism is our mainstay and is going to be that way for a while. How do you begin to even have that discussion at a time like now, when everybody is so laser and singularly focused on getting tourism back up and running?
Well, I think you can't deny that, but I think if you go to the adage that in adversity becomes opportunity, it is now even more critical that we actually do and fill in the margin. So we know that tourism and working on that is critical, but you're starting to see movement towards businesses that come out with deliveries. You have the whole food truck industry that's starting to move forward. Folks that are moving forward on technology-based settings. And so I think it's also talking about how do you make sure we're less vulnerable for these types of hits going forward, and the seeds of that change can start now. And if they bear out now, then we're better served. We've talked a lot about the tech hub. We've talked a lot about utilizing our capacity and the strength of our bandwidth. Now is really a time to put that to play. And you'll see embedded in the recommendations a lot of cross-cutting components, making sure that how we facilitate special economic zones out into the family islands, because that's areas that can be better developed. Looking at incentives and access to capital, and a lot of investment in small to mid-sized enterprises, because those are our future big enterprises. So if we're ever going to make this break where this is not our entire dependency, it is now in the seeds of what comes out.
Another one of those themes was the shaping of an economy that is more inclusive and that facilitates equality of opportunity for all citizens. Again, something we've talked about for a long time, particularly as we get into election season. You know, these things, we've got to make a level playing field and everybody's got to be included and everybody has to have a seat at the table. But, you know, it sounds really good, but how do we move again from just having this discussion and that being a recommendation to now making it a reality? You know, my generation, we're the 40 plus going into 50 generation, and we're still waiting in some instances for our time, for our opportunities. And I'm not just talking about politics, I'm talking about economically, you know, in this country. We still do not have a stake. I've heard it over and over again. How are we going to move from discussing it and it being in a report again to now the reality of it?
I think what we need to focus on is there have been recommendations time and time again with regard to how we can affect certain things, but we need to keep in the forefront of our minds the fact that we should be moving from recommendations to how do we go about implementing, and that is essentially the key. Making sure we're laser focused on implementing these recommendations. Because one thing we can all agree on is COVID-19 has demonstrated to us that there's no greater time than now to unify the country, to unify efforts, and to make sure that we keep our eyes on the proverbial prize.
You know, you couldn't have said it better. I'm just hoping that out of this, we move from the discussion to, as you said, making sure that we begin to implement, because that's so very important. Folks, you've got to take a break, pay a couple bills. When we continue, though, with our conversation, we're going to be talking a little bit more with members of the Committee on the Economic Recovery. So stay with us. Project really pays itself.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Welcome back. You're watching On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer, and tonight we're talking about the way forward. Prime Minister Minnis, when announcing the formation of the Economic Recovery Committee, tasked the group to be bold and creative in their recommendations. He said, a new era, and we are in a new era, and hence we need to think and act in new ways in order to recover as quickly as possible and to build more dynamic and diversity in our economy. My guests for this segment of the show, two members of that Economic Recovery Committee, Khrystle Rutherford Ferguson and Matt Aubry. Folks, how do we remove the unnecessary bureaucratic impediments to commerce and align the country's regime with better international practices? How does this benefit us all? People, when you start talking about best economic, best international practices, people think, well, that's not really connected to me. But how does that translate into, a better way of doing business or better living for all of us?
Right. Thank you. That is a spot-on point. And with regard to that, I think it's important for us to appreciate and understand that the business community, businesses, they're the lifeblood of the Bahamian economy. And I say that because there's a direct impact to adding jobs, to creating wealth, to making sure that you have persons employed and paid wages so that they can provide a living and an opportunity for their families. So it's important to keep a focus on what is best or what is in the best interest of the business community.
Last themes was banking and encouraging more competition within for the financial services space. How do we make it easier while still remaining compliant with compliant and competitive, with international best practices, but also remaining competitive?
Well, I think the banking and the financial services sector, and we were very lucky to have with us some of our colleagues like Tanya McCartney, Bahamas Financial Services Board, and Christina Roll from BCCEC, and the governor John Roll of the central bank. But we had really top folks looking and driving on this in many instances, plus an extended subcommittee. But instances we're dealing with a moving goalpost that we have to keep up with. At the same time, it's a product and an industry that is our number 2 industry. It's one that we're well steeped in, and I think making sure that as we do this, we're nimble. And I think that comes back to your point originally about reducing and minimizing the bureaucratic red tape. We need to, in this instance, foster foreign direct investment, because we're crucially in need of foreign reserves, that as we all know. At the same time, as we talked in the last segment, we need to foster that beginning of the small to mid-sized businesses, the local-owned Bahamian businesses, so that they can drive money that actually is in many instances more valuable because it circulates within our community. And all of that ties into being able to get in the game, stay in the game, and move through the game as quickly as possible. And we are competitive with a number of other jurisdictions that have had some advanced work on this in Cayman and Bermuda. So how can we forge ahead? One of the recommendations that came out as a preliminary recommendation was driving the whole concept of economic residency and expediting that process. And so you'll see embedded in the initial report, but also in the full report, lots of thoughts about not just how do we offer a product, but how do we then make sure that the government systems in place are streamlined, that there's education within our local economy as to how to take advantage of that, and how do we make sure we start to build and keep a skill set here so that we have a viable local workforce. All of those pieces need to work in tandem in order to get us the outcome that we want, which is a more sustainable and thriving Bahamian economy.
Undoubtedly, one of the most talked about recommendations from this Economic Recovery Committee has been the legalization, or the suggestion for the legalization of the cannabis industry, with the objective of ending the punitive impact on young Bahamians, to free up public law enforcement and judicial resources, and to provide a lucrative niche within the agricultural and leisure commercial segments. Explain for us how you arrived at this conclusion and how you were able to find the legalization of cannabis beneficial in so many areas.
Well, I think it's important to note that the recommendations that were drawn in this area were generated through a much larger process, and the group that had been studying and looking at this in advance was highly involved in developing that. But I think that there's a recognized, and it's seen in a lot of spaces, that the draw on government resources, on low level on the prosecution and criminal levels, the negatives far outweigh the positives. And in an instance where there's not a lot of additional to draw from, this became made sense in the current circumstance. Drawing and looking at any new market, I think, which was well vetted and looked at, was, I think, also something that needed to be advanced. And I think it goes to what you started this segment on, the point that there was a call to be bold. And when we looked at the public call for recommendations, there was a lot of public sentiment that supported movement in that space.
That was a very bold call on your behalf, as I'm sure you would have seen since then with all of the commentary on it. Your committee has also set an ambitious goal to increase agriculture and fishery sector contribution to the GDP eightfold over the next decade. Are you attributing that to the legalization of cannabis, or how are you hoping for that to happen if you're talking about increasing GDP eightfold over the next decade, from 150 million per year to 1.2 billion?
I think the methodology behind that really looked at agriculture as a whole, and how can we move forward with making sure there are opportunities for Bahamians to increase their production in many different areas, even within the agricultural space. And that is an essential element for ensuring that there are opportunities and room for us to move in a very sustainable direction. So when you examine that question, I think it has more to do with a methodology and looking at the agricultural space in its entirety.
Okay.
This was also,
Go ahead,
sorry,
Mark.
this was
Go ahead.
also, and this was also, again, reflected of the partnership of talking from the private sector into the government side. And you know that there have been lots of discussions on the Ministry of Agriculture around how to facilitate this. But our reliance as a small developing island state on our food chain coming from elsewhere, it does inhibit our capacity to be resilient and self-sustainable. So making a push, and it's similar in the push to move towards sustainable energy. There's a lot of blockades, a lot of challenges, but there is an opportunity that has yet to be fleshed out. And our capacity, particularly on the fisheries side, has not fully been developed. We have potential of looking at a mining industry. We have potential of small level growth in canneries. We're at a place where coming into us as a port, we can do break bulk or use product that comes in to start to develop out. So there are other ways and innovative ways that can be used to develop this in ways that I think we haven't yet pushed forward. And now is that.
History will show us that we have attempted in the past in industry, and whether it be in agriculture and fishery, we have attempted a lot. We've attempted many of these things or some of these things in the past, and we've seen them, fail. We have seen an attempt to do agriculture at many different levels, and there are not many success stories. Same thing with the fishing industry. I mean, there are people who make a really lucrative living from it, but then by and large, the majority of us don't, or the majority of the country does not enjoy that. What's different? What are we going to do differently that will lead us to success stories? I mean, the results and the history shows it that we've tried. When I talk to young people about some of the industries that would have taken place in some of the family islands over the years, they're amazed to hear about some of the things, but they no longer exist. What's different? What's going to help us to see success this time around? Both of you, go ahead.
I think what is different this time is, again, we look at what's happening with COVID-19, and we look at the fact that there is this urge, there's this deep desire within all of us to see the country move past what we're experiencing now. And you ask what's different, apart from that emotional element of it that is propelling us to do and try something different. We have access to different technology now that can aid in it that perhaps would not have been available back then. So you look at the opportunity for hydroponics and different elements that you can bring into improving the way things have been done before, re-examining previous recommendations, and seeing how you could use innovation and technology to really propel you to the next level. And again, it goes back to being steady with implementation and making sure that you're focused on implementing all of the recommendations that have been made even now and in the past.
And I think it's not a matter of why now. I think it's why haven't we this point, and it's important to look at that. So Khrystle's point early on was the critical question in all of this is execution. Looking at agriculture is not something that's brand new. Oxford Economics a few years back did some work for us and came forward and said that light agriculture could be critical to carving out a market in a local tourism product. How do we build more local ownership in tourism? How does it support small vacation home rentals, which now become a very viable way with some of the recommendations and some of the potential opportunities out of COVID, a way for local Bahamians to be a part of that tourism product? How can we incentivize the use of that to stabilize our domestic market? So before we start thinking about big export, can we get a foothold? And the drive on that, I think, is also how we have to address it. If it's left solely in government hands, or if it's left solely in those private sector folks that have access to capital or foreign direct investment, then it probably won't move forward more than what we need. If it's a more inclusive and connected and multi-sector approach that is thinking about how do we have the skill, the incentive, the access to capital, the standards, and the relationship where this all lines forward, I think there is an opportunity to move the needle.
I also note that one of the recommendations of the committee was for the government to extend on the unemployment benefit payments at the reduced subvention rate at the end of the initial 13 weeks. Why was it so important? And had this recommendation not been made, what would have happened after the 13 weeks?
Go ahead.
I think the recommendation was very important because the reality is a lot of persons are falling on hard times now. And definitely from the business community standpoint, many businesses, many of my members within the Bahamas Chamber of Commerce, they have attempted to hold on to their staff complement as long as possible. But with the impacts of COVID-19, that presented to be very difficult for many of them. So it's important to make sure that you have this continuity of social safety nets.
Finally, one of the most...
There was also...
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah. Oh, no, I was going to say, I think there was also, this was one of the interesting spaces within the Economic Recovery Committee, because initially we were looking at how do we get out in front of this? Once things start to recover, how do we ensure that? This was a much more immediate focus. And so I think in looking at that, it was understood that there needed to be some continuance, but that there also may be limited resources. And as that happens, there should be a move along to help to restore and engage some level of both independence and resiliency. As the COVID outcome unfolds, though, it is something that has to be tracked and looked at, given each week, each month, and how this all plays out.
One of the more controversial recommendations, and one I think Bahamians were happy to hear that wasn't accepted by the government, was the suspension of the $500 personal border tax allowance for returning residents for a period of 6 months. Why was that? I honestly have to admit I was one of those people who was happy. But why do you think, or why was that recommendation put forward? What were you hoping would happen?
We have to look at encouraging domestic consumption. And the reality of it is the exemption provides an incentive in many instances for persons to shop abroad. And we have to look at how do we go about increasing the level of domestic consumption? How do we go about encouraging our people to shop locally, shop at home? Because there's a direct correlation between persons shopping locally and shopping at home, and there being more funds flowing into the economy that goes to greater levels of jobs, greater opportunities. So it's really with that thinking in mind. How do we go about encouraging persons to shop home instead of potentially incentivizing, some may say, to shop abroad and bring back goods?
And you know what? Go ahead, man. Quickly, we've got to wrap up.
No, I was going to say, it hurts on the front end, and I think it's tough. But we have to look at that. What does it look like in moving money through and keeping it within our economy? The benefits long term are tremendous. Every time we shop away and we bring it in, it goes away and it doesn't circulate in a way that it can achieve a lot of success right now. And right now, that's a critical need. Keeping these businesses afloat is important. And
you're right. And I have to be honest. I'm one of those folks. I purchase abroad. Particularly if you travel a lot, you pick things up. But in this current situation, I found myself going out and getting things that I normally would purchase abroad. And I even thought twice about ordering some things online. And I just, I looked around and I made some purchases here. And as I remind people, every dollar you spend, locally, whether it's the guy who cuts your grass or, somebody who comes in and does some work for you, or anything that any monies that you spend locally go back into the domestic economy. And I think sometimes we miss that. I said it up front, I was like, why would they want to take that away? But, in listening and the rationalizing of it, it is important. And I hope that people realize the importance of continuing to spend in the local economy, even as we reopen and some of the restrictions are removed and people start to travel again. I hope they just don't use that as an opportunity to go abroad and purchase, but realize the importance of the domestic economy. Yeah.
Jerome, if I can add to that, I think at this pivotal time, there's no greater level of patriotism that one can show than shopping at home.
Excellent. Good way to end. Matt, Khrystle, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a fantastic discussion. I hope that people understand the work that you all have been doing on the committee, and thank you for that, because I know that serving on these committees are not always easy. And I'm just hoping and praying that government really takes seriously your recommendations and move from recommendation to implementation, because that's what we need, and that's so very important. That's been a theme that we've talked about tonight. So I'm hoping and praying that we get there, and thank you so much. And I hope that this is not the end. A lot of times we see these wonderful committee reports that are presented, and there's a great big press conference, and it's tabled somewhere, and then 3 years later it's somewhere collecting dust on somebody's shelf. So I hope that this time around that a lot of these recommendations are implemented. And I encourage you as well that sometimes recommendations have to be tweaked, and I hope that you guys are continuing to look at what is happening, and it's a fluid situation and change as you go. Sometimes some things are great in recommendation, but certainly are not practical in the implementation. So again, thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing with us. I'm sure we'll talk again sometime in the future. As always, I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, and that's going to do it for this week's episode of On the Record, The Way Forward. Special thanks to all of my guests. Thank you so much for joining us as well, and to my technical team, and of course to you, our viewers. So we invite you to stay tuned, same place, same time next week, right here on The Record. Thanks for watching.